Today we are going to be presenting our weird and wonderful science concept. How does the sun provide the Earth with energy?
The year level this focuses mainly on is Year 5, with the content descriptor being the Earth is part of a system of planets orbiting around a star, the Sun.
The key concept that we have chosen to emphasise is the sun provides energy to plants by the process called photosynthesis.
The elaboration from the Australian curriculum that links closely to this is recognising the role of the sun as a provider of energy for the Earth.
So firstly, this is part 1 of the assignment, CDSU. As part of the CDSU, it is super important to first discuss with the students what they will be learning about and then proceed to the research and information of the content, which is the weird and wonderful question of how does the sun provide energy to the Earth. So we firstly go into, when you look at the sun, it looks like a giant ball of white light, and this is somewhat true. The sun is a ball of gas that is made out of 2 atoms, helium and hydrogen. Through the use of these 2 atoms, the sun creates energy in its core through a process called nuclear fusion. This is where the pressure and heat of the sun's core causes the hydrogen atoms to split and the center of them to fuse together to make a helium atom, which generates the light that radiates to the Earth to produce the different energies. The main source of energy that radiates from the sun is solar energy. Solar energy is any energy that is produced by the sun which causes wind and weather and sustains plant and animal life. Another massive part of the sun's energy is broken down into 2 main parts, heat energy and light energy. Heat energy is the result of the movement of tiny particles called atoms, molecules or ions in solids, liquids and gases. Light is technically any form of radiant energy, but is almost always taken to mean visible radiant energy. These 2 main concepts play an essential role in keeping all living things on Earth alive and incorporates our key concept of photosynthesis. During the day, plants consume carbon dioxide from the air, light energy from the sun, and water from either the ground or rain into their leaves. This all comes together to create sugar or glucose, which provide the plant with the nutrients to survive. The plant then releases oxygen and any leftover sugars. This is what's called photosynthesis. It is already clear to us that the sun plays a vital role in keeping all living things on Earth alive. It does this through what is called the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is a natural process where the sun's energy keeps the Earth's surface warm. This happens in 3 different steps. Firstly, the solar energy from the sun radiates to the Earth's atmosphere through powerful rays called ultraviolet or UV. These rays are transformed from light energy into heat energy. The oceans and land on Earth then absorb the energy, making the Earth's temperature become warmer. The heat then begins to travel from the Earth's surface back into space. However, the Earth's atmosphere traps the heat in. This causes the greenhouse effect, which leads to the constant warming of the Earth. Now, before going into the rest of the lesson, just reiterate to the kids what they have just learnt, and then talk about it and discuss it before moving on. Hopefully this makes a difference in your teaching.
The lesson plan will consist of 3 out of the 5 E's, these being the engage, the explore and the explain phase. At the start of the lesson, the teacher will inform the students that in today's lesson they will be learning about how the sun provides energy to the Earth. Students will be told that although the sun provides energy to the Earth in multiple ways such as solar, wind and ocean, they will be mainly focusing on biomass energy in the form of photosynthesis. The teacher will direct the students' learning intentions towards the role the sun plays in plant life and growth. The students will be in groups of 4 at desks and will all have KWL charts. In prior lessons, the students have done KWL so they know exactly what they need to do. So the teacher will ask them to fill out the know and want to know parts. The question is, how does the sun impact plants? Once the students have done this, the teacher will aim their attention to the board, where they are now to watch a video on the difference between summer and winter in Finland. In Finland, they only receive sunlight for 4 to 5 hours, and therefore this video is to show the students of how the sun affects plant life. After the students have watched the video, they will start to explore the explore phase, where the teacher will inform them that in today's lesson they will be conducting an experiment. The experiment will be to create 3 different seed heads, one that stays out in the sun all the time, one that is in the sun for 4 to 5 hours, and lastly, one that is put into a cupboard or dark place that receives no sun. The teacher will get the students to write down their hypothesis for what they think will happen to the different seeds. Since the students have done previous experiments, they already know what dependent and independent variables are. The teacher will ask what will happen to the dependent variable, the plant, if the independent variable, the sun, is altered. The teacher will also ask what will happen to the plant if there is no sun, minimal sun, or a lot of sun. Before the students can start the experiment, the teacher will need to go through basic health and safety guidelines for the lesson. These are no running in the classroom, no throwing objects, seeds and soil are not for consumption, wear safety glasses and gloves at all times, and if there's any spilt substance on the ground or desk, raise your hand and the teacher will come around and clean it up. Following the safety guidelines, the teacher will explain to the students that doing experiments is a privilege, and if they choose to be disruptive, then they are given a choice: either continue misbehaving and sit out of the experiment, or behave appropriately and continue the lesson with their classmates. After the safety guidelines and behaviour management is said, the teacher will now explain the steps to perform the experiment. These being: number 1, in groups of 4, fill 3 cups half full of soil. Number 2, to place 1 seed in each of the cups underneath the soil. Number 3, to drizzle some water into each of the cups. Number 4, to write full sunlight, minimal sunlight, and no sunlight with their group names on each of the cups. And the last step is to place their 3 different cups on 3 separate trays: a yellow one, a black one, and a blue one. The students will now proceed to conduct the experiment in their groups, while the teacher walks around and observes. While the teacher is walking around, they will ask questions to the students to check how they are going and to see if they need any assistance. Once the students have finished and have placed their seed heads on the trays, the teacher will place the yellow tray in the sun, where they will stay, and the black ones in a cupboard without sunlight, and lastly the blue ones will be put into the sun for 4 hours each day. After the students have completed the experiment, the teacher will bring out samples of this particular experiment: 1 cup that has been in the cupboard that gets no light, 1 that has been set out in the sun for 4 hours, and 1 that is always in the sun. These have been planted 8 days ago, so there is some growth for the children to see. The one that has received no light will be the shortest, the one that received the most sunlight will be the biggest, and the one that received minimal will be somewhere in between. The teacher will place these on the table in random order and gather the children around. The teacher will then ask, "Now children, from your predictions, can you select which one of these has had no sun, minimal sun, or only sun?" After the children have selected the correct cups, the teacher will now ask what they think has occurred. The teacher will explain to the students that the plants that received the most amount of sun were able to grow faster than those that did not. Lastly, to the explain phase is after the students have done the experiment and observed the samples, the teacher will now get them to go back to their desk and will discuss scientific terminology of what they have seen. The teacher will explain that what occurred is called photosynthesis, and this is basically the cycle of plants and how they make their energy by absorbing water, minerals, carbon dioxide, and of course sunlight. Plants that make their own energy are called autotrophs, and these produce energy for heterotrophs, being animals that cannot make their own energy and rely on autotrophs to survive, like rabbits eating bean plants. To relate the experiment back to the video they watched, the teacher will ask, if we are now to think about Australia compared to Finland, which country's greenery will grow faster? The children's responses should be that Australia will be Australia, as during the day we get more sunlight and therefore our plant life have more sunlight to absorb. After this, the teacher will get the students to finish their KWL charts, and write down what they have learnt. At the end of the lesson, the teacher will ask each group to tell the class one or two things that they have learned from today's lesson.
Throughout this lesson, there have been necessary adjustments made to ensure all students are being catered for and optimal learning is achieved. One child has a hearing impairment of severe deafness. This student requires a sign language interpreter for all speech throughout the lesson. Visual stimuli has been provided for this student, as well as the assistive devices such as FM radio that is connected from the teacher's microphone to the student's hearing aid and speakers in the classroom. This student is able to communicate through the interpreter or through apps linked from an iPad to the interactive whiteboard. For the student with autism spectrum disorder, there have been modifications implemented to set the student up to be successful in this lesson. These modifications include 1. The child coming in prior to other students, 2. Selecting where to sit, and 3. Having a certain role or job throughout the lesson to keep this child focused. There are booklets that have been laminated for the student with the classroom rules, expectations, and safety guidelines. The student can refer to these throughout the lesson, and the teacher can also remind the student to refer to it. This student has the option to do this experiment alone if being distracted or distracting other students. A student in this class has a severe case of multiple sclerosis and requires a wheelchair. Wheelchair access into our classroom is necessary at all times, and there must be enough space provided when seating arrangements are made. This student also needs to be positioned at the front of the classroom, as blurry vision can sometimes impact this student's learning. During group discussions and rotations, this student is nominated as the group leader for that table to ensure they feel a sense of belonging and equality. Lastly, there is a child in this class who is classified as legally blind. This student has a number of assistive devices such as reading glasses and magnification tools to help with the learning. There are only dark-coloured pens to write on the whiteboard with, as the light-coloured pens are too difficult for this student to see on the whiteboard. There is also another student who is teamed up as a buddy in case they have trouble reading the instructions or have any questions or input to the lesson. For this particular lesson, there is butcher's paper readily available for this child, as everything, in particular the KWL chart, can be made larger and easier for this child to read. By implementing these adjustments and modifications to suit each individual child, the learning needs are being catered for, and these children are being set up for successful learning.
The assessment item paired with this activity is a formative assessment and is closely linked to the activity, as students will be completing it throughout the duration of the experiment. This approach towards completing the assessment is effective as it provides students with a hands-on method to carry out the task. The assessment task is an experiment workbook which works through the entire process of the experiment. Students will be required to complete the workbook individually, and each sections in the workbook should be completed with the appropriate terminology for that stage of the experiment. This assessment will be completed throughout the explore and explain phases of the experiment. In the explore phase, students will identify the causes and effects, the different variables, create a hypothesis. Students will also develop a research question, list the materials and equipment, and the methods used. Students will also be required to list any safety considerations and finally record their results. This process will allow students to have insight and an understanding of the many factors that play a part in the experiment. Once the teacher has completed the explain stage, students will have the knowledge of the scientific terms behind the experiment they have just done. Students will also have created a clear current dominant scientific understanding to allow them to complete the conclusion and discussion of the assessment piece. The conclusion section of this assessment requires students to explain their understanding of how the sun provides energy to plants. Students' answers will be expected to include the correct and appropriate terms relating back to the experiment they have just conducted. This part of the experiment booklet is key in assessing the students' knowledge and understanding. The conclusion relates back to the main question that students have been exploring whilst also being based around the activity. This gives the students a chance to put their understanding of the concepts and experience into their own words. Finally, the discussion section in the experiment workbook allows students to reflect on the experiment and on their recordings to evaluate how they could have improved any part of the activity. This improvement may be in terms of the practical activity or the theoretical part of the activity. This discussion allows students to see any areas which may have caused them to have a differing CDSU to the correct one, and to then understand what would have made it fit with the current dominant scientific understanding. This assessment piece highlights many areas in students' learning, particularly developing scientific inquiry skills. Students will make predictions, form hypotheses, make observations, record results, and discuss the scientific reasoning behind the activity they have completed. The accompanying rubric for this assessment reflects the student's ability to thoroughly complete the experiment workbook, utilizing the correct scientific terminology within each section. The rubric explains to students the level of understanding and completion of work that is expected to be done within each section of the workbook. We hope this video has informed you and assisted you for your future teaching.